Ever wondered about what Philo, yes, ancient Philo of Alexandria, thought about drinking and drunkenness? Well, that's exactly what we're going to discuss on this 186th episode of The Jewish Drinking Show, bringing L'chaim to life. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of The Jewish Drinking Show. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan, and I'm excited to welcome first-time guest of the show, Rabbi Dovid Campbell. Rabbi Campbell, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. All right. So for those who are less familiar with Rabbi Campbell here, he is an independent researcher and writer whose work explores the history and future of Jewish philosophy with a particular focus on the importance of a non-dogmatic and creative approach to Jewish thought. His articles have appeared in Tradition and Ḥakirah, as well as numerous Jewish content platforms, including his Philo of Alexandria and the Soul of the Torah essay, which you can find up at the Lehrhaus. He holds a degree in microbiology from the University of Arizona and resides in Ramat Beit Shemesh in Israel with his wife and his children. So, Rabbi Campbell, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a lot of fun.
Before we really dive into this topic, Philo of Alexandria, can you give us an introduction to him, who he is, why he, sort of his significance, and a little bit about him before we dive into really the bulk of our conversation today?
Looking back, we can ascribe a lot of significance to Philo. He's essentially history's first theologian. H.A. Wolfson says he's essentially the beginning of Western thought. The idea that revelation and reason can actually have a synthesis. Wolfson said that begins with Philo and it ends with Spinoza. So it begins with a Jew and it ends with a Jew. Right? But so that's, retrospectively. At his time, Philo was a teacher. We could call him today a philosopher, and most likely some sort of communal leader in Alexandria. We know that his brother was an important tax collector in Alexandria, and Philo seems to have had some sort of, if not a statesman, some sort of political role in the area. So he wore a lot of hats. But he comes down to us primarily as, quote unquote, the first Jewish philosopher, really.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so, well, thank you for that. So clearly it sounds like you're setting us up to talk about philosophy and ways of thinking today, right?
Right.
Which
Fair
is,
assessment.
yeah, which is not something we've really dealt with a lot on the show. I think the only other one we've really had discussion was really about a year ago when we had wine drinking and drunkenness in Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed. So this is joining sort of the philosophy around drinking sort of sub-series. Okay, awesome.
Right.
Full on disclosure here. I have not read much of Philo, to be honest. A little bit, dabbled, read little bits and pieces. But one thing I did notice is that when he starts talking about Noah, that he then has a whole separate essay that he decides he's going to dedicate to drunkenness, drinking and drunkenness, right? So I definitely know that he talks about drinking and drunkenness. So how would you can you guide us on an exploration of his thought around drinking and drunkenness?
Yeah, this is one volume of Philo. It's in the Loeb Classical Library Edition. It's a 12-volume set. So this is one of them. And this includes On Drunkenness. I don't know if you can see in the camera.
Nice.
But yeah, I'll just read the beginning to you because what you realize a couple of things from how he opens it. He says, "The views expressed by the other philosophers on drunkenness have been stated by me to the best of my ability in the preceding book." So already we know we've already missed half of the conversation when we open the book on drunkenness, right? He's already done it somewhere else, right? So we have to flip back. The preceding treatise, I guess you could call it, is called On Planting. It's called On Planting because it deals with, as soon as Noah comes off the teva, he starts planting stuff, right? So a lot of the time the title will be kind of tangentially related to the subject. So in On Planting, he devotes the second half to Noah planting a vineyard and infamously becoming intoxicated. So he says, we're going to deal with Moses's view of drinking in the next treatise, that's On Drunkenness. But here he says, what I'd like to do is first survey the philosophers. So I was kind of preparing for the podcast. I realized that drunkenness might be a very good test case for coming to an introduction to Philo in general, which is interesting because this is kind of emblematic of his method, meaning he's working with a philosophical tradition, right? But he's also Jewish. He doesn't feel a tension between those two, which probably sets him apart from the later medieval philosophers to some extent, because they're very much aware that there's a conflict they have to undo. Philo lives in Alexandria. The Jewish community there, this was their bread and butter. This is what Judaism was, right? So for him, there's not really a counterculture. It's just that the Torah is philosophy par excellence, right? So he doesn't have to be embarrassed about having this conversation in one context. So what he does On Planting is interesting. He starts out with almost frames it as a kind of trope. He says that among the philosophers, there's this question. He puts it in quotes, it's, will the wise man get drunk? That's
Hmm.
apparently a major subject in philosophy at Philo's time.
Hmm.
Treatises are written on it, especially among the Stoics also. So he says we're going to survey that question. So a couple of things I want to point out because it's interesting. He says to begin, we have to differentiate between two meanings of the word drunkenness. He
Hmm.
says one is becoming silly after drinking, right? So
Hmm.
that's drunkenness as a behavior. And the other is just drinking heavily, right?
Hmm.
Regardless of the behavior, it's just the state of being drunk. So it's the behavior versus the state. And he says we need to separate between those two because more or less everyone agrees that the first one is a problem, right? We don't want
Hmm.
to act poorly because we drank.
Hmm.
But the second one is more complicated, meaning, is it a problem per se to drink to excess, to get tipsy, to be in a state of mind that is, drunk, what we would call
Hmm.
drunk?
Yeah.
So he says, some argue, of course, it's a problem because it's very likely to lead to silliness, right?
Hmm.
There's no reason, right?
Hmm.
Philo's point is maybe not necessarily, right?
Hmm.
So he goes through in this treatise, I think he has he starts with five different pro arguments. Some of them are almost you could call them linguistic. He says we find treatises on drunkenness, right, that really are on wine, and they don't differentiate between being drunk and drinking.
Huh.
So he says, since they don't state as a separate category and they state it favorably, it's reasonable to understand them as having a positive view overall of drinking. They're not concerned about drunkenness as a separate category that we have to write about. An
Hmm.
interesting argument, right?
Yeah.
He has one, though, that I wanted to highlight, especially because he had already told us from the beginning that here we're not going to deal with Moses, right? In
Hmm.
this treatise, this is just supposed to be the philosophers. The Torah view is supposed to be reserved for the following treatise. He gives us his picture of what I call the playful sage, right? He says that, and it's similar to Chazal's concept of, kiso kasto vikoso. You can
Hmm.
come to know a person by how they spend their money, how they behave when they're angry, and when they drink. So
Hmm.
he's saying drinking is really just an amplifier. He says, whatever you
Hmm.
are, you become more of it, right? So he
Hmm.
says, if you're a type of person who has, vices or a negative disposition, drinking will magnify that. But he says, but for a sage, someone who's really worked on himself, it says it's like someone who knows how to swim and someone who doesn't know how to swim. So when the
Hmm.
water comes, the guy who knows how to swim, he'll float to the surface, so you can swim fine. The other person, unfortunately, will sink. So he's
Hmm.
saying for the sage, it's no problem. And he says, it's okay if I quote this.
Yeah, absolutely.
The wise man becomes a more genial person after indulging in wine than when
Hmm.
he is sober. And accordingly, we should not be wrong in asserting on this ground, as well as on those others, that he will get drunk. We must remark furthermore that the countenance of wisdom is not scowling and severe, contracted by deep thought and depression of spirit, but on the contrary, cheerful and tranquil, full of joy and gladness, feelings which often prompt a man to be sportive and jocular in a perfectly refined way. This is an old translation, so you could probably just say playful. Sportive and jocular. Such sportiveness is in harmony with a dignified self-respect, a harmony like that of a lyre tuned to give forth a single melody by a blending of answering notes. And then he adds, Moses, at all events, holiest of men, shows us that sport and merriment is the height of wisdom. And he goes on to show that he says that Yitzchak, the name Yitzchak is laughter itself. And he
Hmm.
believes that that's Moshe's way of conveying to us that the sage embodies laughter, something like that. He told us at the beginning of this treatise he wasn't going to bring in Moshe Rabbeinu, right?
Hmm.
That seems to be an aside that he almost couldn't help himself, right? Which may be even a tipping of the hand. That might be Philo saying, yeah, this argument is pretty compelling to me, right?
Yeah,
Because if wine is really just an enhancer, right?
oh yeah, so I'm actually really surprised. The thing that's surprising to me is this equation of wisdom and a smart person being also someone who's there to, like, I wouldn't necessarily say have a good time, but they're kind and they're nice, which is like, I don't know that we throughout all times and all places there's this equation of, well, if you're wise, you clearly are kind. That's pretty surprising to me.
Right. He's going even further. He's saying not just kind, but if you're wise, you're having a good time.
Mm,
Not in
yeah.
the sense that your goal is just to be silly and have fun, but he says, how could you not have a good time? Meaning the world is a beautiful, amazing place. And if you're
Yeah.
wise enough to recognize that, you should be having a good time.
Yeah.
He says, but he's tapping into something which I think every generation deals with, which is that, you have to be careful what your picture of righteousness looks like.
Mm,
For a lot of us, a righteous man is extremely severe and extremely tense. He says, why should he
exactly.
be tense?
Yeah.
Right? Exactly. And he says that that only comes even more to the fore when he drinks. So at least in this argument, he is saying makes perfect sense. He does qualify, he says he almost has like a Eurydice Hadoros argument, which he says different generations are different, obviously. He
Hmm.
says in our times, it sounds like he's describing a fraternity party. He says the way that people play at drinking and they challenge each other is as if it's like an athletic contest who can drink the most. And he says it's horrible. He says, but it used to be when people drank, they would drink in the context of a ritual and a ceremony. A lot of the time it would happen in the temple. It would be as a result of the spiritual awakening, something like that. So he says there's a context and you have to know which generation you're in.
Like it used to be, everybody behaved so well when they drank before, but now they can feel that's great.
Right. It could be rose-colored glasses, yeah.
Yeah. Hello, dear listeners. It's your host, Rabbi Drew. I wanted to break in right now and just say, hey, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate, or watching, however you're consuming this content. And I'm always open for new ideas, both for specifically the Jewish Drinking Show, whether it's topics, whether it's guests. I'm also looking for other resources that I can provide you with in the Jewish Drinking Project more broadly. Also, I'd really like to offer you the opportunity to sponsor this work. Whether if you want to go to patreon.com/Jewish Drinking, I would greatly appreciate it. And if you have ideas for swag, also please feel free to send them to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. All right, thank you so much, L'chaim, and now back into the episode. What other, highlights in the on planting essay of his does he really have some salient points about drinking and drunkenness, or that's really like kind of the key
So
piece?
what's interesting about On Planting and also about On Drunkenness is they're both incomplete treatises. And this is one of the
Oh.
great tragedies of studying Philo is that we don't have everything. Probably the 12-volume set I have on my shelf is only about two-thirds of what he wrote. And a
Hmm.
lot of those two-thirds were missing sometimes the end of a treatise, sometimes a piece in the middle. He wrote about 2,000 years ago. So we're missing a
Yeah.
lot, unfortunately. The treatise ends with him switching over to the con arguments. So he gives something like five pro arguments, and then he starts with the con arguments. What's
Hmm.
interesting is right off the bat, he starts refuting the con arguments as soon as he gives them. Right? A little suspicious, right? So
Yeah.
the first one is that they say you wouldn't tell a secret to a drunk man, right?
Hmm.
ask a drunk man to keep a secret, but you would ask a wise man to keep a secret. Therefore,
Ah.
a wise man is not a drunk man. Uh-huh. He says, but we could use that exact same logic to say that a wise man never sleeps, right? Because I would never tell a secret to a sleeping man, but I would tell it to a wise man. So it must be a wise man never sleeps. He says, clearly it's fallacious. It's not true, right?
Huh.
That's where the treatise kind of cuts off. So
Hmm.
Colson's one of the editors and translators, at least of this series of Philo. He says
Hmm.
it's usually assumed that Philo goes through a few more of the cons, knocks them off, and then the treatise as a whole ends with a positive, view of, will
Hmm.
the wise man get drunk? Answers in the affirmative. He
Hmm.
says, but it is possible that this entire thing is really the pro argument. Meaning even the con arguments that come at the
Ah.
end, which he knocks off,
Yeah.
yeah, are really part of the pro. And it could be that there's an entire another second section where he gives the real con. He says we just don't know,
Hmm.
right? So it's hard to conclude from this treatise itself how Philo believes at least the philosophers end up. But
Hmm.
I would say the overall thrust of what we have is positive. And
Hmm.
again, the fact that he's including Torah even in this treatise where he said he wasn't,
Hmm.
that even Moshe Rabbeinu says it, etc.,
Yeah.
suggests to me that he has a pretty positive view that at least the wise man who knows how to handle his drinking can get drunk.
Interesting. So
That's on planting.
before we transition into the drunkenness one, so it sounds like he's, really dealing with this in the context of the philosophers who, sort of the Greek philosophers who've come before. How much are we getting a sense that he's similar or different in espousing even just this piece about this wise man can't get drunk piece?
Similar to the philosophical tradition.
You know what? Yeah. So maybe that could be a good test case for how does his philosophy sort of what's the context? How much is he taking on sort of what else is in the intellectual milieu, and how much is he bucking what's out there already?
At least in on planting, which we just finished,
Hmm.
I think the view is very positive, and he's surveying again the philosophers, but you feel there's a lot of Philo in there himself. He's clearly adding and editorializing, so to speak.
Okay.
On drunkenness, where he's actually his goal is to give us, Moshe Rabbeinu's picture of drinking,
Hmm.
it's much more negative overall. But again, we
Hmm.
have a problem because we don't have the complete treatise. He says that Moshe discusses drinking in five different contexts. So one
Hmm.
is foolishness.
Hmm.
Second is insensibility, just becoming out of your wits.
Yeah.
Third is greediness. Fourth is cheerfulness and gladness.
Huh.
And the fifth is nakedness,
Uh-huh.
right? So he says, and he goes through each. Our treatise only deals with the first three. So we don't actually get to see him treat cheerfulness and gladness, which is the most ostensibly positive of the five.
That's so
right?
far. And the
But
nakedness,
but
obviously,
it
I can't help but think about Noah when I hear nakedness. And but that is that
right
also
makes sense.
excluded? Is that also omitted?
Right, that's the fifth one.
Oh, that's
Exactly. So we
omitted.
don't have
Okay.
that one either.
It's the
Exactly.
pages got cut off. Okay.
Also, these things they weren't in books; they were on scrolls. So very often, when you lose
Oh,
a scroll, the first thing you lose is the beginning and the end.
yeah.
So yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
the ends tend to fall off.
Mhm.
But so again, so what we have in this treatise is overwhelmingly negative. At least the parts that he covers, right? It's associated with all sorts of things that we ideally don't want to be doing and falling into. So he says
Mhm.
that Moshe is giving us, at least in what we see, generally a negative portrayal. One of the things that's interesting on drunkenness, and really any time that Philo is dealing with stories in Tanakh in general, is his allegorical approach. So if you read a
Mm.
little Philo, this is one of the things that jumps out at you right away, almost jarringly so. I'll read you a line. This might be jarring or not, depending on a person's where they're coming from. But so he wants to talk about Shmuel and Chana, right? Chana is
Mm.
one of the most famous mistaken cases of mistaken identity with respect to drinking, right? It's Tanakh, right? She's assumed to be drinking when she comes to the Mishkan. It turns out she's not drinking. She's really just embittered. And so that gives Philo a great opportunity to speak about the sense in which, because again, he noticed that Chana means grace in some sense, chen, right? And a soul that's full of grace is drunk in a positive sense, meaning it's intoxicated
Mm.
with a connection to God, right? He takes it in that direction. He says, dealing with Shmuel, he says, now probably there was an actual man called Samuel, but we conceive of the Samuel of the scripture not as a living compound of soul and body, but as a mind which rejoices in the service and worship of God, and that only. That's already jarring, at least for the modern reader. Philo never feels the need to dismiss the historicity of Tanakh, but it's secondary for him, completely secondary. He says there's probably a real guy named Shmuel. I'm not so interested. What does Shmuel represent? That's his. So again,
Mhm.
he's very much what we would call today drush, very
Yeah.
much as
Yeah.
Philo's. If Rashi is in a mikra elamidei pshuto, Philo's the exact opposite. He's interested in the drush. So again, that idea that Chana, which represents the again a spiritual intoxication, produces Shmuel, who's at the height of holiness, is significant for him. That there's a type of spiritual drinking, which is, but again, it's allegorical because he's talking about a certain type of quasi drunkenness.
Mm. I wonder if his allegorical readings of scriptural stuff in stuff in the Torah, or well, obviously now more broadly Tanakh, if that is so that people don't get so stuck on what happened that it's stuff that there's lessons for people's lives. Is that sort of the advantageous aspect of going allegorical?
I think for Philo, he says, if the Torah is not addressing the deepest elements of my inner spiritual journey, then it's not really talking to me. It could be an interesting history book, and the Greeks have interesting history. But if it's not actually about me, and my development and what I'm supposed to do here and now, I can't connect to it. So I think it's essential for Philo that the Torah be doing this.
Okay.
And I think allegory for him is how it happens, something like that.
It's so funny how much it seems to presage like, Kabbalistic or Hasidic approaches. So it's really, but for his time, it's super
There's a
fascinating.
lot of interesting scholars. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting scholarship on. So Rev Shmuel Belkin, who was
Hmm.
the first Rosh Hashiva of YU, right? So he devoted a lot of time to Philo, right? He has
Mm.
books and books on Philo. He calls Philo our earliest recorded medrash, right?
Wow.
So he takes that seriously. He said he found what he believed to be parallels between Philo and later midrashic tradition. So he believes Philo is kind of, holding on to an earlier midrashic tradition that he gets mostly from the land of Israel,
Hmm.
right? And is preserving a lot of it's obviously original to Philo, but he's also preserving a tradition. So for
Hmm.
that reason, he's also very interesting. And right, to what extent is he influencing Philo is generally considered a middle Platonist. So he's between Plato and between the Neoplatonists,
Hmm.
right? So to how much did the Neoplatonists read Philo? To what extent was there an indirect influence? That's also an interesting subject in the scholarship.
Hey there, I wanted to break in. I hope you're enjoying the episode so far featuring Rabbi Campbell as we are discussing Philo on drinking and drunkenness. I want to give you a sneak peek into our next episode, which will be about vermouth, kosher vermouths available on the market.
It happened around the same time
Mm-hmm.
that all of these vermouths, hit the market. So it was
Mm-hmm.
about 4 years ago. There was only the Kerems.
I hope you enjoyed that sneak peek into our next episode on kosher vermouths currently out on the market. That will be coming out in 2 weeks from now. 2 weeks. We're not having an episode next week, but I hope you come back for that episode in 2 weeks. And now back into this episode featuring Rabbi Campbell. So you mentioned already, so you said there's like 5 components. We don't have the last 2. So what are those? How does he deal with those first 3 components?
Foolishness or talking foolishly, that one takes up most of the treatise. It's like from paragraph 11 to paragraph 153, meaning it's usually they break them up into paragraphs, at least in the modern printings. So that's the overwhelming majority. And it gives them a lot of different opportunities to, places where, drinking leads to bad things. So for example, Ben Soramor, right? The wayward and rebellious son, that takes up a lot of the treatise. But again, he allegorizes it. So it becomes a question of, to what extent within a person these dynamics are going on. Almost in every case, he'll take, whether it's a narrative or whether it's a mitzvah, he'll take it and describe it in sort of an internalized view. There's other places where Philo deals with drunkenness in his other commentary series. So generally, this is a 1-volume Philo, quite the tome. And the scholars generally break it up there into 3 different series, and broken up based on likely audiences, differences in style, who he was. Someday they're not even sure if he was writing for Jews or non-Jews, right? But they each have a slightly different goal. So at the end, he has one called Questions and Answers, right? So these are almost line-by-line commentaries where he goes through, starting at Bereshis, and we have until about halfway through Shmos, and asking, again, a question on the verse and his answer. So that also gives us the opportunity to deal with Noach, because he looks at him there as well. So what's interesting there, I made a note of this. The verse says he drank of the wine and was drunken. He says, what does that mean? He drank of the wine and was drunken. So he says, in the first place, the just man did not drink the wine, but a portion of the wine, not the whole of it. Already he's defensive, right? Noach didn't drink too much. He drank some of it, right? He says, by the religious and sober man, everything necessary for food is used in a moderate degree. And the expression he was drunken is here to be taken simply as equivalent to he used the wine. But there are 2 modes of getting drunk. So again, Philo makes this distinction between 2 modes of getting drunk.
Wow.
Right? So in other places, he's much more critical of Noach, right? And he paints it as, for sure a mistake. Here he's saying, no. Read between. He was drinking, but not getting drunk. And sometimes the word getting drunk means drinking, but not to excess, not behaving silly, something like that. So again, depending on who that commentary series is for, it might reflect, a different goal Philo has in his exegesis, something like that. There's another place where he discusses drinking as a concept.
That is interesting. How would you characterize? So you mentioned, all right, so the 3 sections, the 3 topics within the well, first of all, thank you for the Noach piece about the line by line. But going back to the on drunkenness essay, so the first of those 3 sort of topics are the foolishness, and what are the other 2 that we have that are extant?
Right here, foolishness, insensibility, which is an interesting term, right?
Yeah.
So here again, meaning he's taking cases throughout Tanakh that have an example where someone gets drunk to a deleterious effect. So for insensibility, his focus is on Lot. Lot's another tragic example of where someone drinks again to the point of insensibility and makes a mistake. Right. So Lot and his daughters again serve him as an allegorical opportunity to discuss, what happens when a person drinks too much, drinks to the point where they can no longer tell between right and wrong. Right. And Lot is archetypal in that sense.
Yeah.
And then the last one was greediness. So here his focus is on Paro, Pharaoh, and his 2 servants, right? One of them is a baker, but the other is a wine, the cupbearer. So for Philo, Paro always represents desire. Egypt in general represents, pleasure, desire, the body, really.
Yeah.
And Paro, as the leader of it, is again, so the cupbearer is the one who is, again, he's bringing wine for the service of pleasure and desire. And again, so fleshing out the allegorical mode.
Yeah. Then does he contrast that against bread for the baker? And if so, how does he work that contrast?
So for him, the baker is indulgence. I don't know if it was an issue that they were having at the time, but for some reason, confectionaries and bakers is something he keeps coming back to and railing against. These confectionaries and people baking donuts or whatever they're eating back at the time. He's railing against, right? And he says the cupbearer is obviously wine. He says that the symbolism of the fact that the cupbearer is reconciled with power at the end is that pleasure always comes back to wine. He says that a person might be able to push off other things, but there's a unique desire for drinking that can be more problematic, something like that.
Yeah, that's really
These
neat.
extended, just as a side note, these extended allegories to the fact, yeah, they sometimes are beautiful because he stitches everything together very nicely. You can kind of see how the symbolism works together, and the whole story is one extended allegory. And sometimes they're more forced, but he's not giving up on his program either way. So sometimes you'll read Philo and it's beautiful, and sometimes I'm missing what's happening here, but that's for sure his method.
I remember one of the first times I had a conversation with someone when they were interested in bringing me out, actually entirely based on this, the Jewish Drinking Show. They liked the content, they liked what they heard from me, and they wanted to bring me out. And during our conversation, they said, hey, we know you have a lot of really great content, but we saw somewhere that you do tastings also. I said, I do lead tastings, and I do texts and tastings. So I realized I did not do a good enough job, certainly on the show and probably in general, and letting people know, in addition to actually sharing really wonderful content about drinking and Jewish wisdom, history, tradition, literature, and more. But I also do tastings, and even better, marrying the two together, doing texts and tastings. So if that's something that's of interest to your shul, organization, JCC, whatever it may be, feel free to get in contact with me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. So thank you for letting me break in and share that with you. And now back into the show. How would you describe how he's discussed, like both in a sort of a general sense, and maybe if you could provide some quotes in his On Drunkenness essay, like where does he ultimately come down? Like where is also how, I have two sub questions also appended to that. The first of which is like, how does it relate to wisdom? Because I know he spoke about the wise man already on planting. And then the second is, what's the significance or importance of wisdom, and how does that intersect with or not with the drinking and drunkenness?
The metaphor he used before, which I think is probably most illustrative here, is he says that the wise man is like a person who can swim, and the drunken man is the person who doesn't know how to swim. So wine, he says, is like a deluge, it's a torrent that comes over us. And he says, if you're wise, you can, ride the wave, so to speak. It doesn't overcome. He says, versus a person who doesn't know how to swim, you can feel the wine overcoming such a person and they behave poorly. So he says, wisdom, at least on planting, is really almost like an inoculation, so to speak. It protects you from the wine. And then, as we saw in his quote about Moshe, it's even magnified, or at least the personality of the wise man is brought in its fullest, most positive light through the drinking, because again, it's just a magnifier of what he has inside of him. So in that sense, it's very positive.
Hey there, I wanted to break in yet again. Although I asked for support in financial ways, because it does cost some money to make the hosting happen and other aspects of Jewish drinking happen. So your financial support is definitely appreciated. And don't forget, you can go to jewishdrinking.com/donate. But also, another way of supporting the show and everything that Jewish Drinking does is also to tell your friends, tell your neighbors. If you like this content, if you like this show, maybe people also like it. So feel free to let them know, hey, I have this interesting episode I heard, or a few episodes, or whatever it is, or even a few clips. Feel free to share with your friends. All right, thank you so much. Now back into the show.
I did want to end off with a quote of his that's more personal.
Sure.
Which is also one of the things that I think is very interesting about Philo, because you do get a lot of personal reflections. He'll think about things that happened in his life. I was at a boxing match and I saw this and it made me think of something. He has passages like that.
Wow.
He's sharing his personality and his life in first century Alexandria. So he has a passage. This is again in one of his allegorical interpretations. And he writes in general about, we have to be careful about going to banquets and eating too much and drinking too much. He makes a note of strong wine. It can be difficult. And then he adds, almost as an aside, he says, I know this from frequent personal experience. Keep in mind that Philo was high society. His brother was one of the wealthiest guys. Josephus mentions that Philo's brother donated gold and silver doors to the temple.
Wow.
Right. So Philo, he would have been a name. He would have been he would have been invited to yes, high society in Alexandria.
Wow.
So he says, I know this from frequent personal experience. For when I attended an unrestrained gathering or a sumptuous banquet and did not arrive there accompanied by reason, I became the slave of what had been provided, the sport of wild masters, sights and sounds, all that produces pleasure through smell and taste.
Huh.
But whenever I arrive with persuasive reason, I become master instead of slave, and with main force win the noble victory of endurance and self-control by resisting and striving against all that excites uncontrollable desires.
It's
So
fascinating
this
to
is fire.
me. It's fascinating. The main difference, the differentiator here is the reason, or the reasoning. Although it doesn't necessarily sound like he's going to enjoy these banquets sober. Like he's still drinking, but he knows how to keep himself controlled.
Right, kind of exactly like we saw on planting, right?
Yeah.
What I get out of that quote so much is that, first of all, it's very bold of him to share. He's essentially admitting that, hey, I went to some of these banquets and, I overindulged and it didn't go well for me. And
Hmm.
I'm, ashamed of it, right? Which is, again, just, nice of him to,
Yeah.
he's making it real and he's making it personal and he's not ashamed to say that he's slipped into this challenge himself.
Mhm.
But his point is that, when I go with, again, reason, wisdom, something along those lines, like we saw in the earlier treatise, he says, I'm able to, ride the wave. He
Hmm.
mentions in On Planting, I didn't quote this part before, but he says, even the most anti-drinking side will still acknowledge that there's times when you're supposed to drink. There's celebrations, there's cultural, there's customs when
Yeah.
it would be rude, it would be inappropriate, not to have l'chaim with the people there.
Yeah.
Someone gets rescued from something, there's a national victory, things like this. He says there's context,
Yeah.
but he says, you want to approach these sorts of things with, your head on straight, something like that. So again, this wasn't someone in a, secluded in a cave who
Hmm.
never touched wine and never drank wine and is telling us about these in theory. This is a guy who went to the parties, and had to
Yeah.
deal with this probably on a weekly basis. Everyone's inviting him to these things, and he actually had to deal with it. He had to find a way, like, okay, how do I not get pulled into Alexandrian high society, but still be involved in it? Because again, I'm someone in this world, and
Yeah.
that's very much Philo.
That's great. That is a great coda to this. So, Rabbi Campbell, this has been interesting, insightful, fascinating. Before we conclude, is there anything you would like to promote?
Thank you so much. It's been amazing and fun. Always a chance to talk about Philo. I love it.
Great.
I have a website, natureoftorah.com, where I post things occasionally. If you want to check out more of my stuff, it's up there. I post things occasionally on the Lehrhaus, which is where you found me.
Yeah.
And check it out there. I have a good friend, Rabbi Simi Lerner, who's doing a lot of, he has his own podcast and is appearing on a few others, but
Mhm.
really cool things if you're interested in Rav Hirsch, Jewish
Hmm.
philosophy in a modern context. Really cool. You should have him on sometime. I'm sure
I
he could tell you about
should.
Rav
Yeah. I'll see if he's
Hirsch
done
and
anything
drinking.
about his drinking. Yeah.
Totally. But
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you for the heads up
it's
on
amazing. But
that.
yeah, it was a pleasure.
Okay. Awesome. All right. Well, Rabbi Campbell, thank you
For
so
sure.
much. And L'chaim.
L'chaim.